before we get started, I have a lot of stuff I want to get into. I want to talk about your book, but I wanted to just thank you first off. I'm a huge fan of your work. How Did This Get Made was the first podcast I ever listened to. And it came at a time when I was living in LA and I was having a hard time finding joy in my life, and that
Yeah.
podcast brought me a lot of joy. I would find episodes about certain movies and walk to Blockbuster and rent the movie and then listen to the episode. And yeah, so it meant a lot, and I just wanted to thank you first and foremost.
Oh, well,
Um,
that means the world to me. Thank you so much.
of course, and I you don't remember this, but we met probably 10 years ago, very briefly. My uncle is Chris Corbin, who does a lot at UCB,
Yes, yeah, yeah.
and he took me to one of your Facebook improv
Got it.
shows, and
Okay.
yeah, so it was great to see that you're just as sincere in the way that you engage with people in real life as you are on the podcast. So it was great. So thank you for
Oh,
doing this. I really
well,
appreciate it.
my absolute pleasure. Where do you live now?
I'm in Texas now, but I spend a lot of time in LA and all over the place. So, yeah, Texas is where I'm originally from, but I'm back here full time now. Anyway, yeah, I just had to get that out of the way first. But I guess since your book is a lot about your childhood, and it's something I love on your podcast how open you are with sharing crazy stories from your
Right,
childhood, and it's something I really relate to. I was like I'll tell stories, and to me, they don't seem that crazy.
right.
I had a lot of like near death experiences or like medical issues and stuff, but then a bunch of other crazy stuff. And it as I'm saying it, other people are like, "What are you talking about? Like that's not a
Right, right,
normal
right.
thing." So I always relate, like hearing Jason and June kind of like stop you sometimes and be like,
Right,
"Oh,
yeah.
that's not normal." So what can you talk a little bit about your childhood and which stories or which parts of your childhood in particular kind of inspired you to write this book?
Well, you kinda set me up perfectly because How Did This Get Made is a show about bad movies and not about childhood, not really even about reminiscing about how we grew up. It really is just about kind of capturing this conversation that you have after you watch a bad movie. But sometimes in talking about these movies, there might be a moment where I'm like, "Well, yeah, but I did something like that." It's like, "Well, what do you mean? Hold on, wait." And these scenarios that seem so kind of outlandish. There's a movie that we did called Milk Money
Mhm.
about a boy who like hired a young sex worker for his dad, who was a widowed man, and I talked about this trip that I made into New York City to like see a naked woman, and that's exactly the opening act of Milk Money. They raise a lot of money to go in and see boobs, and so it becomes like this really organic way of me starting to tell the story that I haven't thought about or told, you know, ever. Sometimes even out loud. So that really was the beginning part of me realizing like, oh, I do have this weird childhood, this because like what you said, Jason and June, be like, wait, you did what? How did you go into the city? And then they're kind of, I call them in my book my first editors because they were asking me these questions. I just assumed like, well, that's normal, right? That's the way things go. And I've been doing that podcast for 14 years, or whatever, 13 years, whatever it is. And throughout time, people will be like, "You should write a book. You should write a book." And I was like, "Oh, I don't know. Write a book? What do you mean? I don't know. Write a book." And but it was something that always kind of stuck in the back of my head. I love writing, and I really feel like I miss writing because back in the day there was Tumblr, there was Blogger, and you were writing more long form stuff. Now you know, basically it's like, can you get out everything you want to say in 30 seconds or less and get a picture and encapsulate it, right? So I was missing some of that, and after seeing like people on Reddit and YouTube put together montages of these stories, I was like, all right, well, what would that look like? What would a book look like? Because I knew that there would have to be a difference between an anecdote and a book, and trying to approach that the right way. So I sat down while my wife June was shooting a movie out of the country. It was during COVID, so she was gonna have the boys for 30 days, and then after 30 days, I was gonna have the boys for 30 days because I couldn't go up there. I was shooting down here, so I really had this rare moment of having the house to myself, which I haven't had in ages. And you have kids, right?
Yeah.
So so I really sat and was like, "Well, what are these stories?" And it was really hard to write them at first. It's kinda like, "Well, what do I wanna tell?" And I started off with the story that I've probably told the most, which is finding out that I was lactose intolerant at, Disney World when I
Mhm.
was a kid, right? And, like, this kind of moment of, like, I think coming into my own adulthood because it's like, "Oh, no, I can't be this youthful kid where everything is great," like, I have to now watch or carry pills, and I sat with that, and I started writing, and I wrote about 4 or 5 stories, but I also wanted to make sure that the stories I was writing weren't just stories that I told, so I was like, "Yes, I told that one," but because I understood, like, that would be a good way in, but now let me try to figure out some other ones, and part of it was, again, going back to that mantra of, like, it can't just be an anecdote because a bunch of anecdotes, it's like, what does that mean? It's just, it will feel light, it will feel like nothing.
Yeah.
And, when I wrote about 4 stories, and I felt like, "Okay, I feel like I got something here." I reached out and found an agent, and I was like, "What do you think?" And they were like, "We really like this. I think you could go deeper." And that was, like, the first note that I got. And what kind of happened was these stories, some which you may have heard from the podcast and some which you definitely haven't, started to be like the real stories, the stories that I can't just tell on stage without derailing the entire show. Or, these are the stories that I've really never said out loud. So much so that when June read the finished copy of the book, because I didn't let her read it until I had the whole thing together, she's like, "Wait, that happened? This happened?" And that was really surprising to me. It wasn't the book that I necessarily set out to write. I didn't know what it was going to be, but for me, it became apparent as I was writing it that it was a book about me wrestling with coming up as a child in a slightly, and then this is like a overused term, but like a fucked up situation. Like I was in this world where I was like things were not right,
Yeah.
and how that kind of rippled effect through my life, and how it kind of reached this like tipping point when I wanted to have kids. Like, oh man, do I want? How will I not fall into the same exact traps? Right? What can I do
Yeah.
differently?
Well, the
And so I
things
think,
that you thought
yeah,
weren't right sorry to interrupt, I
yeah,
just
no, no,
wanted to
please,
ask,
please.
you saying things weren't right, were those things that you noticed as a kid, or were they things that you kind
Yeah,
of realized
absolutely.
as you got older?
No, I think it's half and half. Like it's funny because I just went skiing. I do this comedy festival in Telluride every year since 2004. When I was broke as hell, we would go up there. They give us free skis and free passes, and we do comedy shows at night. It's the most fun. Now I'm not a skier, or I wasn't a skier because when I was a kid, I just didn't want to ski. I was like, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. And my parents would be like, okay, well, if you don't want to do it, you have to wait for us here in like the ski lodge. So I have so many memories of just waiting for my parents in a ski lodge while they had a whole day out skiing. And I was telling that to June. I hadn't thought about that. It's not in the book, but I hadn't thought about that in such a long time. I was like, would spend like 9 hours or 8 hours just like in the ski lodge. She's like, what do you mean? I was like, yeah, they just left me there. Look, I said I didn't want to do it. They didn't fight me on it, and that was it. But as a parent now, I know that like I fight my kids on stuff like that all the time. It's like it's skiing. It's like I'm not taking you to like, it's like sometimes you just gotta push them through difference, or a unique or a new experience or sometimes scary to them. So I think it was for me, it was like understanding that there were certain things in my life that I don't really talk about that much. And there are things that I'm like, "That was weird. I was a latchkey kid. I had, situations that were very similar." I have a whole chapter about, kind of my Home Alone situation. I had this guy try to break into my house, like a home invasion style when I was a kid. I was all by
Whoa.
myself, and, so I knew those.
You're, like, dropping marbles on the floor and
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. I had a lot of, what do you call those,
booby traps.
Rube
Yeah.
Goldberg devices. But, so for me, I think where I found, like, the crux of the book was I don't think I could have written this book before I had kids, and I think having kids really had me examine parts of my life that I didn't really examine before and
Mhm.
look at, and so that was really part of the fun of this book. It kinda grew before my eyes, and, for example, that story that I started off telling you about, like, about the drinking milk and Walt Disney World. Like,
Yeah,
I always told that as a funny story about, "Oh, I found out I was lactose intolerant there." But as I was writing the book, what I kind of found was, and I mentioned this as I was saying the first time, but this is something really that I put it in the last pass, was it was this, like, loss of innocence. Like, it was this moment where all my friends are running for pizza, and I had to be, "Wait, hold on, I gotta make sure because I got so violently ill that they were like, and lactose that we live in a culture now, nut allergies, weed allergies, everyone's got their own thing. Like, back then, I was the only kid whose parents were divorced, and I was the, only person who had something like this. Like, to say I was lactose no one had a nut allergy, no one had anything, so I felt like a little bit of an outcast, but I also felt like, my kid's main, source of diet is mac and cheese and pizza, right? So it's like, and, like, that was a moment of like, "Oh, no, now I have to, like, be protective," and I know that, like, I'm very aware of, like, I don't wanna wait it, like, then being lactose intolerant changed my life. It did and it didn't, right? But it's like, these are these markers that you start to be like, "Oh, right, that's when I got a little bit more like this," or "That's why I changed a little bit more," because it is like, as a kid, when you go from not thinking about anything to
yeah,
going like, "Oh my god," like, you know, I got so violently ill, like, I was like, I'm gonna am I gonna die?" Like, I don't because I never gotten that way. Like, I was talking to my friend about this yesterday. I was like, "I don't know, you said your kids were sick, a little while ago."
yeah,
And the worst thing to watch is your kid about to puke because we know what it is, but they think they're going to die. Like, they don't know. Like, the first time it happens, like, "Ugh," it's like it's out of their nose, it's tears, it's shitting themselves sometimes. It's everything.
yeah,
It is a full body breakdown. And it's like that, and all you can kind of be is like, "I'm here for you. I got you. We're here. We're gonna go through it. You're not gonna die. We're gonna get through." But it is like that first, like, everything
yeah,
just like shuts down. So I that was really traumatic for me because when I did find out that
I
I was
bet.
lactose intolerant, it was like I destroyed a hotel room. I mean, I did I was like I was Sydney Pollock, not Sydney Pollocking, I was Jackson Pollocking all across that room. I just didn't even know what was happening to my body. So to know that, like, and again, a time before Lactaid was in stores, like, I had to go to, like, a special place to get I was like, "Oh, we could get this for if we're near Garden City," which is, like, kind of, like, 40 minutes from my house.
Yeah,
Like, it wasn't like, none of this stuff was accessible, so anyway, uh, it was kinda, and that's, like, a very, a light version of it, but the book, I think, is really fun because it kind of had me wrestle with these 2 sides of myself, like being a child who is parented, and then being a parent who has to, take care of children, and I think we all wrestle with that to a certain extent, of how we want
yeah.
our relationships to be.
Well, it's so I relate to so much of that. One, like I've started mapping out a book that I want to write as well because I've had the same experience of people saying you need to write down these stories. And as I was writing them down, there's a whole chapter I have that just is about stories of me shitting myself.
Uh,
And where I so I totally relate to you destroying the hotel room. Also, I have a Disney World story as well. When I was a kid, I was there with my family, and they had like a petting zoo area, and there was a cow, a dairy cow with like Mickey Mouse spots on its side. It looked like a Mickey Mouse
right.
head.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and I was standing up on the fence petting it, and I think I was like 8 or 9 years old, and I was petting it, and it like whipped its head up to like get a fly, and it hit me in the chin, and I almost bit my tongue in half. My tongue was like
Oh.
hanging by a thread. And as soon as I sat up, it was just like
Mm.
the elevator in The Shining, just like blood pouring out.
Ah.
And within seconds, like every employee in that area had surrounded me. They took me to the Disney World hospital. They gave us like an extra week free,
Oh
and all
my
this stuff.
god.
Like, yeah, we got a bunch of really cool perks, so it worked out. Um, but yeah, it's so interesting too. You talking about some of the things that we realize when we get older versus the things that we knew were fucked up as kids. Um, and like one of them, I was in LA recently for some press, and I was out there. I had a few like off days, so I was just driving around. And as I was driving, I was like, I'm gonna go look at like just drive past the places I used to live whenever I was out
Right,
here.
yeah.
And I have the most supportive mom in the world. Like, growing up in and out of the hospital, she could have been super like helicopter parent, really protective. But she wanted me to have a normal childhood and to experience life. And she believed in me, like, wanting to pursue acting. So she, at 13 years old, sent me out there to go to, like, an acting summer camp.
Right.
And I got signed by a manager, and I kept going out there every summer. Then I started to homeschool so I could focus more on acting and spend more time out there. So from, like, 13 to 18, I spent at least half of that time out there on my own without my family. And it was, in the moment, it was like, "Oh, this is awesome." Like, I'm doing what I love. I'm with other kids that are acting, and, like, I'm pursuing this dream of
Yeah.
mine. Um, but as I've gotten older, and especially after having kids, when you start to self-reflect more, I've realized that I have this, fear of abandonment, and I was never really abandoned as a child, like, from what I could tell. But then as I started to really look into it, I was like, I lived at from 13 to 18, I lived in 18 different places out there with different families, different
Mm.
people.
Yeah.
And looking back, I'm like, man, that I was physically away from my mom, even though she was being supportive emotionally and, like, supporting my dreams. I think that just that physical distance and not having that reliability, like, in person, uh, I'm sure caused some sort of, issues there. And it's nothing that she did that was bad. She was just supporting me and doing her best. But it's stuff like that I've realized as I've gotten older, and it's so interesting, like, making those revelations and seeing the differences in how you were raised versus how you wanna raise your own children. Um,
Yeah, and I
yeah,
think, I think it's this thing when you're a kid, you really don't know what's, like, right or wrong, right? Like, you don't
yeah,
and you are constantly looking to your parents, on some level, and they set the tempo, the tone, and, and things that are bizarre can be normalized, and I think wrestling with that and looking at that differently because if no one pays it any mind, then it's not that big of a deal, right? Like, I talk about
yeah,
that in the book a little bit, like this idea that, you know, when I had this like home invasion moment, fighting off this guy who was coming into my house, like I
How old were you at the time?
probably like probably 4th or 5th grade,
Wow.
and this is the that I would say if anything has to like check me out in this book, that's the hardest thing. I can remember stories to a T. To tell you how old I was, I'm like, I know I moved at this point, so I couldn't have been in 6th grade, but I probably am in. It's so funny. It's like that. Like I could tell you every detail of a story, but the age is like that's the only time I really guessed on
Yeah,
anything in my book. But it was definitely 4th or 5th grade. But like I remember telling my parents or my mom and my stepdad, and it was like, "Well, you're okay, so it's not that big of a deal, right?" And it's like it's these emotional shockwaves, like, if you're not able to process some of this stuff, and I think that, like, I remember when my son, came home from school, like, after, Uvalde, right? It was
yeah,
the first time, right, that he was old enough to understand what a school shooting was, right? And that was a really interesting moment because I think as a parent, I'm looking at something and I'm going, I know what Uvalde is. I know how I feel about certain issues with guns and especially in schools and the way that protecting kids and
yeah,
I have passionate things about that, and but I can't bring that into his world. I have to be here and let him come to me and talk to him about like what are you feeling? What are you worried about? Because what he's worried about is not going to be what I'm worried about.
yeah,
I'm seeing the macro, he's seeing the micro, right? And it's like he's like, "Well, I'm nervous about this and that." And I would never have guessed that, but I'm like instead of just saying it's going to be okay, it's like, "Well, let's talk about it. Let's figure it out. Like let's let me hear you. Let me make you feel seen." Instead of just saying, "Don't worry about it. That's Texas." I know Texas is your backyard.
man,
I'm like, but I'm
yeah,
like, "That's far away. That's not going to happen. You're going to be safe. It's okay."
yeah,
And that's easy to do, and that actually doesn't give any like, it doesn't allow your child to process something, especially something traumatic, and, we're fostering a dog right now. Our last dog, passed away, or we put him down. He was sick, and I'm watching my youngest son, like, really process that right now. Like, he really is it was hard for him, and he goes back to it, and, it's not like, "Well, it's okay, he was sick, we did the right thing." It's like, all those things are true, but there's
Mhm.
an emotional thing going on here, and I think that I love my parents were amazing, there are some things that they did great, there are some things they did not so great, um, but you have to, like, empathize with your kids, and I think that that's the thing, and 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 I think it's about people like us, like, that are trying to be self-aware, trying to understand what we are trying to do, like, and how we wanna be different or how we wanna acknowledge it, because sometimes you can't you don't even know that you've buried it until you are able to, like, be in a space where you can actually say it, because if my parent
Yeah.
says to me, "It's okay, you're fine," I'm like, "Oh, it's okay, I'm fine." And I may have this thing like, "Well, I didn't feel fine, but it's okay, I'm fine." My elder has told me that, right? It doesn't
Mhm.
actually deal with anything, and I think that's important, like, as a parent, like, to hear your kids and really, like, I mean, and I know everyone's like, "Well, I listen to my kids," but I mean, but really, like, you get on that level with them, because I don't think that we even know what their fears are,
Yeah.
sometimes. It's
Well,
our fears.
yeah, yeah. My oldest, she's 8. My kids are 8, 5, and 3, and
Okay, so I have a 9 and a 7.
okay, yeah, so they're all around the same age, and my oldest, it was the same thing after Uvalde. They did a shooter drill at her school, and, I picked her up, and she was telling me about it, just saying, like, "If a bad guy ever came into the school, this is what we're supposed to do." So as a
Right.
parent, like, hearing that alone is a terrifying
Oh
thought,
god, the worst.
um, and especially because it happened there was that, and then there was a shooting in Allen, Texas, at the outlet mall
Right,
that is
yes.
right down the street from me, and it's like, I like you said, I have so many opinions on all of that, and it's so frustrating, especially in Texas with certain decisions by the leadership here, but that's a whole other conversation. But my daughter, um, was telling me about it, and I was just asking her, how it made her feel, and like what their plan was at school, and what the drill was like. And then she was telling me, and then she just kind of stopped for a minute, and then she started crying and said that because she was asking me, like, what if I'm in the playground and a bad guy came out there?
Right.
And I was like, well, there's a fence there, you could climb over the fence, and I was like, run to the street if you have to, if something like that ever were to happen. But it probably won't, but it's just good to have that in mind. And then that's whenever she kind of stopped for a second, because she was just doing the what if thing that kids do, where it's like, what if this happened? Well, what about this? Like, they love asking hypotheticals. But then she started crying, and I realized, I saw in the rearview mirror and asked what was wrong, what she was feeling. And she said, I don't want to leave any of my friends though. And it's like just such a gut wrenching thing. But it's like those things that we can't always just say, "Oh, well, it's gonna be okay,"
Right.
or fix everything. It's just like, yeah, that is a scary thought, I'm here for you. Like, just help let them go through those feelings and process it. It's just such an interesting conversation that, like, you never really think about before you have kids, but then you do, and then you're just like, "Oh shit!" Like, this is it's
Right. Well, you know what it and you're right, like, it's like when it's an interesting age because they don't know everything, but they know some things, and
yeah,
it really is emotional, like, I feel so badly about this thing that happened, like last year, 2 years ago. We went away to Mexico, and it was like our big like winter vacation that we were going to do with the kids, and it was super fun. And we went with our friends, and they have 2 boys. We have 2 boys. They're about the same age, so they are just thick as thieves. They have the best time. They're running around. Now we're in this resort that's completely, um, you know, landlocked. I mean, like, you can't get out. It's not like we're off a highway or anything like that. It is like we're in, and, there's this, like, video arcade place, like a full room with knock hockey and a movie theater and all these games, and it's, like, Nintendo games, and so it's, like, they are always like, "Can we go to the arcade as soon as they're done with dinner? Can we go to the arcade? Can we go?" "Yeah, of course." Like, "Where are you gonna go? It's not that big of a deal." So, they were playing in the arcade, and I said to them, "Alright, I'm gonna be right here. I'm having dinner. I'll be right here." So, I go down to find them, get them to bring them back to bed, and none of them are there. I'm like, "Oh my gosh," I might start to panic, right? And I go back to my table, and I'm like, "Well, they're not there." And we're really talking about a 50-foot distance. There are a
Yeah.
lot of stairs and a lot of bushes and things like that, I'm like, "Where could they be?" I am having a
It's like
complete meltdown. Yeah, go
Madeline
ahead.
McCann. It makes me think of the Madeline McCann
Yes.
documentary on Netflix.
Yeah, and so I'm having a complete breakdown, but I know there's 4 of them, right? So it's not like
Yeah.
and, long story short, my wife gets a phone call. She's in our room, and they were at the hostess stand at the restaurant because they left to go find me as I left to go find them. They didn't see me at the table, so they went to the hostess stand to be like, where and we missed each other, and my youngest was beside himself, and I w and this is my moment where I'm trying to make it okay, and I'm like, "Well, but you were with your brother, you weren't alone, and you also were with 2 friends, like, and you were these people were helping you. These are the hotel people. You didn't like, you're okay, you're okay." And it it took me a long time to, like, get out of my own way a little bit and kind of be like, "No, he's fucking freaked out." Like, I feel badly, but, like, I gotta acknowledge, like, like, "Yeah, I fucked up here." I didn't did I fuck up? I fucked up in the sense that he felt, like, lost and that he was alone. So and it's sometimes hard to admit that. I feel like my biggest goal as a parent is trying to admit that I'm wrong to my
Mhm.
kids so they understand, like, mistakes can happen, and I'm not infallible. I am a flawed person, and so are you, and it's okay to be that, and we can love each other, and we can make mistakes, and we can move forward. But that moment, I that was something I really had a hard time wrestling with because I could talk to you about Uvalde and say, like, "Oh, I sat with my kid, and I really let him tell me about where he is at," and that's so I can be outside of it, but when I was responsible for it, gosh, it was hard for me to be
Yeah.
like, you're fine, it's okay, it's okay." You know, it's hard to sit in something when you've messed it up, so it's something that I wrestle with, definitely as a parent.
Yeah, parent guilt is so real, and
Yeah.
it's constant. I you telling that story just brought back a memory. I don't think I've told this story on the podcast before, but I was in a situation as a kid where I got lost on vacation with my siblings and friends, like the other kids that were there with the other family. So I was on that end of it where we were at a ski resort and our parents were out eating and we all stayed in the hotel. So the two older siblings were watching the rest of us. And we asked if we could go outside and like play in the snow. And our cabin was like right up against the mountain.
Right.
So we went out and we were playing and we just kind of kept venturing further and further up this mountain into the woods. And eventually it got dark and like lost our way back. So we were stuck up in the woods on this snowy mountain
Oh my god.
playing, and our parents got back and it was the same thing. We were gone. We were trying to find our way back. And they ended up calling the police and the people at the hotel went up with like four-wheelers and I have really bad asthma and being in the cold it got bad. So I was coughing up blood on the side of this mountain as like a 7-year-old where they had to bring me back down on a stretcher behind this four-wheeler down the mountain. So that's another one I need to put in the book because I totally forgot about that one. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, anyway, I want you talking about like parent guilt and owning when we've made a mistake and apologizing to our kids. That's been a huge goal of mine too, because it's kind of like I feel like that was such a foreign concept for our parents' generation and like beyond because at least for me growing up, like my dad was very he was the disciplinary. I grew up in a divorced family as well. But he was like a Marine, a cop, a lawyer, all these authoritative figures. He would accuse me of like, I'd come home and he'd be like, "Have you been smoking dope?" And he'd look at my eyes and like, I'm like, "Dad, I have severe, I haven't, I've smoked my inhaler and
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
it."
yeah.
And he like, so I had that. And then my mom, who's the sweetest person in the world, but she avoids, like, if there's any conflict, if there's anything like that, it's just like, nope, everything's okay. We're fine. Like, where there wasn't the room to really sit down and have a vulnerable conversation. And it's so interesting as I've had kids of my own. I've talked to both of my parents about all these like revelations, and it's been interesting seeing them process a lot of it. But I'm curious what your going back to your childhood with your parents growing up in a divorced family. What was the dynamic like that like for you? Like how what were the differences between your mom and dad's houses and their like parenting styles, and what was that like as a kid? Because you were an only child as well,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
You know it to me, it was really interesting because, wow, my parents, I am half of them, right? I'm half my dad and half my mom. My mom is they're both wonderful people. I think one of the things that was really tricky in writing this book was trying to talk about them in a way, because book is a sliver. It's a slice. Like, I realized as I finished this book, I'm like, oh, there's so many stories I didn't even touch on. I barely touch upon anything in my career at all in the book, because it's like that's not what this book is about. This book is different, but it's hard because when you're telling a story, you're telling the parts that are integral to the story that you're telling, not the you're not painting a full picture. You don't need to paint a full picture because you don't want to confuse it. So, my dad was always my buddy. Like, he was very present in my life, even though my parents were divorced, and incredibly supportive. And he was, for all intents and purposes, like the good time guy. Like, but not the good time guy in the sense like he uh was without responsibility, not at all. Like he was, we just had fun. It was like, oh, hanging out with my dad was like going to see movies, going to Yankee games, um, watching Saturday Night Live. Like we gelled. We liked the same stuff. Um, and my mom, was the person I lived with all the time. My mom is, you know, she's an incredibly wonderful person, and I think that she is very much like me. She's like a workaholic. She really, my mom, I think, just stopped going to school like 4 years ago, and she's like 70 something. She's a lawyer, she's a nurse, she's a therapist, she was a biofeedback technician. She just always kept on adding to her plate. So my mom was always a very head in books, black and white kind of person, uh, but also was somebody that I could really go there with, and she married this guy, um, who the book is making me call Hunter, but is not his name. And this guy was a little bit more of a tricky figure because he was like a truck driver for a local supermarket chain, and he was very different um than anybody else in my family. And gruff and rough, and um I think felt really angry that I had a relationship with my dad, right? So there's a competition between him and my dad, and um, which made things really interesting because he also had 3 children of his own. So it was like, he wasn't, like I talk about in the book a little bit. When we first met, I wasn't given a choice to call him uh, Hunter. I had to call him Dad.
Oh,
And that was something, yeah, right, and when you say that now, right, you're like, "Oh,
yeah.
oof,"
Weird.
right? But as a kid, it was like, "No, that's you call him dad. He is dad." And I think about that now, we're talking about these moments where you look back and you go, "Oh my why? Why was why?" And I knew it was wrong, but why? And that, like, So he was that kind of person, and it was like, until I called him dad, he wouldn't like, he would ignore me, unless I called him dad, like, like, literally, like, treat me like a ghost. Um, so he was a lot of, there was a lot of, like, mental and physical abuse coming from him, and my mom was also caught under that same kind of, um, banner, like, we were living under this really unsteady, not stable kind of force in our lives. So, it's interesting that, like, my the time with my mom, I think, was fraught with this energy, and then my time with my dad was incredibly relaxed. There was, it was, you know, safe, not safe, fun, more stressful, but it was even less than that because, again, I'm looking at this now as an adult and go, I can tell you what the difference was. I couldn't say that what the difference was in the moment, right? It was just sort of like, this is, well, that's Hunter. Hunter is Hunter, and that's how he acts. And I get with it, like you just described. It's like,
Yeah.
you're smoking dope, or you like this. There's no other option, right? To kind of take it in. So yeah, it's interesting, and my mom and dad remained really good friends, throughout really didn't have, like, I don't talk about this in the book at all, but it really didn't really have a falling out until I was, like, 30 years old, which is
Wow.
amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
and, I think I think that they have gotten back together, um as we've had kids and stuff. But
Yeah.
it's like and it wasn't even like a falling out, like, it wasn't like, oh, we're never talking to you. It just was like, oh, things used to be easy, it got harder. And who knows? And it's
Sure.
such a, yeah. So
That's really interesting because my parents get along really well too. They're so opposite, so I'm genuinely glad that they didn't stay together because it would have
right,
been bad for both of them. But, they like, we'll go on family trips where my stepdad and my mom and my dad are all together, and we all go to Mexico together or whatever. So it's such an interesting I relate to that so much, them getting along and not really having a lot of contention even into to adulthood, for me. But, I wanted to ask too, throughout all of that, like the trauma and, just difficult, situations or circumstances, where did your sense of humor come into play? And like your when did you start to kind of see that that's something that, you could lead with and, even further, like that's something you could possibly turn into a career? Like where did all of that, because I feel like a lot the funniest people typically have a lot of, shit that happens to them as
right.
kids. So where did all of that kinda come into play?
You know, it's interesting because it was, as an only child, I um I basically made my own play, right? Everything was a show. I love TV. I grew up in a time. It's so funny. My kids right now, like, don't give a shit about TV. They love Mr. Beast. But like, as a kid, I was like, oh my gosh, I have the VHS. I could rent movies. I could watch movies. I could tape movies. I wanted to be inside that TV. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know why I wanted to. I just, like, I loved Saturday Night Live. I love, it like my parents are, my mom is, like I said, a nurse, a therapist. My dad's a pharmacist. They're not familiar at anything in the business. Like, they can't, like, oh, this is something that's even reachable to you. I lived on Long Island, which is 45 minutes outside of the city, but even then, what do you do? These are people don't know. There's no internet. There's no way to find out how do you get involved in this stuff.
Yeah.
So, you know, um, so for me, uh, I, I just wanted to be on TV. I didn't know what that meant, so I just made my own TV. I'm at a time where, and I'm aging myself here, but where, like, we rented video cameras because, if you rent it, you could rent it for, like, $20 a day, or probably even more than that. And you could put a VHS tape inside there, and you could make your own shows. So, like, sometimes around the holidays, we'd have, like, oh, we'll rent it for the holidays and plus 2 days on either side of it, and I would just make my own videos and do this other stuff, just wanting to just be there. So I think part of it was not even like I want to do comedy. I just want to be performing. Now, what did I find? What I love was that. I mean, I think it'd be hard pressed to find any kid who's like, well, I really liked, the dramas of Dynasty and Falcon Crest, like,
Yeah.
I wasn't like, I just wanted to be I wanted to be Arnold in Different Strokes. I wanted to be Jason Bateman in It's Your Move. I wanted to be all these people. So, so anyway, that really is like how it it kinda started, and I think one time when I was a kid, I read this local paper, and they had, like, a spotlight on kids. It was called, like I grew up in a place called, like, they had a paper called Newsday, and every Wednesday, they had something called Kids Day, and Kids Day was, like, a quarter of a page that was, like, kid-centric stuff, "This is the kid who won the local spelling bee. This is this." And the one time they had an interview with um, an acting teacher, and I was like, "Oh, okay, like, she's like, and she teaches here in Long Island. Oh my gosh, I gotta, I called her up and I was like, I wanna do this. And that's really how I got involved in it. Like, honestly, like, just, if I didn't read that Kids Day, I wouldn't have taken that first acting class. And then I think that opened me up to, uh, oh, I can go do something else. Like, I can go find this. It's like it's weird because it's like, how do you find any of this stuff? It's all kind of happenstance. But the way I kind of found comedy and specifically improv was through going into the city with my dad, because my dad and I, like I said, good time. We do fun stuff. My dad lived in Queens, much closer to the city than I lived in Long Island, and we could go into the city and see shows. We saw, like, Neil Simon plays, and I feel like back then it was, like, $15 a ticket. It wasn't expensive. It was, like, a more expensive movie ticket, which is now, now it's, like, $100 to go see a show or whatever it is,
Yeah.
and so we saw, we had seen everything, and one of the things that we looked at the listing in the paper, and we're like, "Oh, what's this? Chicago City Limits." And Chicago City Limits was like an improv show, very much like a Whose Line Is It Anyway short form improv thing, and I was like, "Let's go see that." And we saw that, and I was like, "Holy shit. This blew my mind." I'm like, I'm watching these people make stuff up on the spot. I'd never seen improv. I didn't know what this was. There was no Whose Line Is It Anyway. This is just like, oh, like I was like, this is the coolest thing. And yeah, so that got me into improv and comedy, and then that led, eventually to UCB, and but everything is like a weird um step, like a weird, it's like, oh, it's not
Yeah.
like people always say to me like, well, Paul, like, what kind of advice do you have for people who are starting off doing this? And I think everybody wants me to, it's like they want to hear directions, like, "Oh, you
Yeah.
do this, this, and then this." It's like, but that's not, careers don't, it's hard. It's a bunch of little steps. It's a bunch of steps in the wrong direction. The
Yeah.
wrong classes lead you to the right friends that bring you to the right place on the right night. Everything is a sliding doors scenario. And I look back at my career and I go, "Oh my god, thank God I did that instead of this, or I did this and that." But you don't know, and it's like, and I didn't know, and there's no way to game the system. There's no way to cut through that. Like, that's part of like the cutting your teeth in this world of just like, "Okay, I'm here now. Now I'm here. Okay, what am I doing now?" And so, yeah, that really to me was like, how did I get into comedy improv? Too too hard to tell, but, um, I think the thing that what I did was when I found things that I liked, I leaned in. And I really was able to do that once I was in college, because when I was in college, um I could actually, like, I didn't need somebody to take me to that acting class, right? Like, like, I remember, like, oh, my parents couldn't take me to that acting class I took on Long Island anymore, so I stopped taking that acting class. As
Yeah.
simple as that, right? And that was it. And, again, and I don't blame my parents. I'm not mad at my parents for that. It's like, yeah, well, that's what it is. That was life, and I got also busy too. I probably didn't wanna do that in high school. I don't know, it's like, oh, I just stopped taking it. But it was funny because in writing this book, there's a lot of questions. I'm like, "Why did I do that? I don't know. I don't know why I did." Like, there's just certain things that weren't for these are not, like, intellectual conversations that you have as a kid, right? Like, it's like, "Oh, yeah, I just didn't do that anymore. We moved." Like,
Yeah.
and you're not keyed into it. And I tried very hard to keep the perspective of my book from my point of view, not like, "Oh, well, I talked to my mom, and the reason why we moved was this and this." It's like, sometimes, like, I remember the first time I went to a doctor out here in Los Angeles, and, they're asking me about my family history, and as I was telling them my family history, I was like, this is all bullshit. Like, this is things that I was told as a child that make no fucking sense, like, I was like, "Oh, wait, that doesn't make," like, as I was saying it, I called my mom, I was like, "X, Y, and Z," and she's like, "Oh, no, 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 it's A, B, and C." I was like, "Oh." Like, but you forgot to, like, get the clarifications. So in my mind, I'm like, "Oh, my grandfather died because of this.
Yeah.
Oh, and that they're sick, that was sick. No, no, that was cancer." Whatever it is, it's like, and that's the kind of, like, I feel like that those things are so elusive. It's so hard to kind of figure out how you learn stuff or how you got there.
Yeah. I don't wanna take up too much more of your time, so I have a final question that I always ask, end all of my interviews with, but before, I just wanted to give you a chance to, like, plug your book, like, when it's releasing, your podcast, or anything else that you wanna plug. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so tell us about your book, your podcast, and all that stuff.
No, absolutely. Look, I mean, the most important thing right now for me is pre-order my book, because this is the thing that is the most important, I guess. I didn't realize how important the pre-ordering world is. So even though my book comes out in May, you can order it as an ebook, an audiobook, a hardcover book, whatever it is. And if you pre-order it, you can go to my website and fill out a little form, and I'll send you a personalized postcard. And I also have a special part of my website that's completely built, that is, like, an exclusive VIP access to, like, little things. I don't know how much sense it will make now, but when the book comes out, like, they're right now I'm teasing things, because I can't show you why they all tie together, but there's a lot of, uh, I'm having fun building my own DVD special features, and yeah, and, like, to your point, like, I have my podcast, How Did This Get Made, which you talked about, and Unspooled, which I do with a film critic, named Amy Nicholson. So, yeah, we just have a blast, and I'm just Paul Scheer at social on everywhere in social media. Got I do it all. I got Substacks, I'm streaming, it's like I think we're all in this world where it's like you just gotta kinda do everything.
Yeah. I do wanna, so my grandpa is, Barry Corbin,
Mhm.
um, and, he has been in, No Country for Old Men,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
he just did Killers of the Flower Moon, but he's also done some truly awful but hilarious movies that if you ever do an episode for People Across the Lake,
Yeah.
that's, I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's a TV movie he did that was kind of like a Psycho ripoff. Um,
Oh, wow.
it's amazing and awful, and I highly suggest it, if you take any recommendations, but
Okay, no,
yeah,
I'm gonna take it under advisement. I love that.
People
I
Across
mean,
the Lake. Yeah,
you're, like, there's so many. I mean, he is, such a crazy, interesting career, right? Because,
yeah,
uh, there there I tell a story about Bill Cosby in my book, and, I just have this weird run-in with him. And I made a joke, um where I kinda say I made a ghost dad joke, and I took it out eventually because no one got what I no one remembered that movie of
yeah,
Ghost Dad, and I know that, Barry is in Ghost Dad.
yeah, yeah,
Uh, but, like, it's like but it was so funny, I think about that, I'm like, "You see? Yeah, that's the audience, Barry would get that,
yeah, yeah,
they got Ghost
he
Dad reference, Barry." People are
he'd
like, "I don't
appreciate
what are you
it.
talking about? What do you," like, they're like, because it sounded like I was referring to him as a ghost, and then I put in, like, parentheses, "dad," and it was like and it was flagged every single time.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I was like, "Oh, okay, I can't." And again, because he's so tricky with, being a rapist. You don't wanna, like I didn't wanna be like, it's like everyone's like, "Ah, well, what are you saying?" Like, "Alright, well,
yeah.
it was just a reference to a Sidney Poitier movie."
Yeah. Well, it's awkward, like, that's actually the first stand-up show I ever went to was a Bill Cosby show
Oh
with
my
my
gosh.
grandpa, and we went backstage and met him afterwards, and at the time, it was like, "Oh, this is awesome," and then, yeah, it got tainted, obviously, down the road. Um,
Jordan, I'll tell you, I literally saw Bill Cosby, and the, and I feel like the drive home, that story was breaking.
oh,
Like,
wow.
in a major way. We are like, "Huh?" Like, it
You're
was like, we had the it was I talk about that, like, it's like, and I know, like, Hannibal's like, "It's always been out there." I just had never heard it like that, right? Like,
yeah,
but it came out, like, if it came out within the next 24 hours, it was so funny. June and I were laughing, so I was like, "Well, there we go. We'll never be able to talk about seeing that
yeah.
show."
You're, like, in the middle of composing a tweet about how great the show was when you
Yeah,
see
and
the news drop. Yeah, that's, It's well, there are that was one that was truly a shock. Like, I remember even at 14, people making, like, Harvey Weinstein comments or jokes when I was in LA, where it's like there
Yeah,
are certain things where some things were kind of public knowledge, but that was
yeah.
one that I feel like most people were like, "What the hell?" But yeah, that it was a good show objectively, but, just not a good person. Um,
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a tricky thing. It's like, like, and there's that argument I think that you always are that people are always having. And we talk about this on Unspooled too. It's like, um, you know, like if I say if like Woody Allen or the guy who directed Chinatown, and I'm forgetting his name.
oh,
But
yeah.
yeah, like all these people who have been canceled. Like, we do not celebrate their work, and on some level, by not celebrating their work, you're also taking some amazing work out of the picture. Like, right? Like there is
Yeah.
like it's like for me, oh my gosh, I'm just blanking on her name right now, who's in Annie Hall. My God. Uh,
I'm blanking on it too now.
yeah. Uh, why are we know it, and everyone's screaming at it who's listening right now. It is, oh my gosh.
Are you
Diane Keaton.
There we go,
Like
yes. I almost said
I don't wanna live in a world where there's not that Diane Keaton performance. Like, it's fucking
yeah,
phenomenal. Like, or conversely, even Jack Nicholson's performance in Chinatown, right? It's hard. It's like a hard thing to kinda separate. Like, Cosby Show was a big part, like, a big part of so many things like, that I loved, but it's like,
yeah,
it's hard. It's a hard, you're always wrestling with it. I
it's
don't think we have
tricky.
to celebrate the person, but we can also
Yeah,
celebrate that, I don't wanna live in a world without, Diane Keaton is that. I mean, that is, I think, one of her most seminal characters of all time.
right. I'm gonna ask you this last question, but before I'm gonna send you a link. I don't
Mhm.
know, let's see, Bill
Yeah.
Cosby Show barbecue sauce.
Oh, yes,
Have you
I've
seen
seen
okay,
this, I
good, okay.
yes.
I will send it.
I
I
mean,
saw that
that
for the
is
first time the
yes,
other day.
whoa.
Shocking. It's
It is a
like
shocking moment, and but here's what I think. Can I tell you, like, my that Bill Cosby thing?
please do.
That to me is the writers knowing exactly what is up,
Yeah,
and they put that in the script, and he is, uh too dumb or narcissistic to understand how that's so implicating of what he does and who he is. But like that's clearly the writers being like, "Oh yeah, no, this guy's a fucking scumbag." Like,
yeah,
and it's we were talking about that. I was talking about that today. It was like, oh my gosh, I can't remember who it was in reference to. Oh, it was in reference to Doc Rivers. Doc Rivers, an NBA coach, coached the Celtics to a championship, is now the Milwaukee Bucks coach. Um, why would you want to get back into coaching? He kind of left coaching and he got back in, and it's like there's this, and now he's getting eaten alive in this past week after the All Star break, where people are just like ripping on him because whatever, he's Doc. I love Doc, but there's a narcissistic quality to be like, "Why are you going back into the fray? If you wouldn't have gone back in there, people would not be attacking you like this. But you go
yeah,
back in, you coach the Bucks, you make them go on a losing streak, you blame everybody else, and now everyone's gonna come after you." And it's weird. It's like that disconnect of not
yeah.
knowing, like, "Oh, get out while you're ahead."
Yeah, well, it's even like Kevin Spacey making those weird videos
Oh, yes.
as his House of Cards character, like, stuff like that where it's like, "Dude, what are you doing?"
What
Like,
the fuck are you up to,
it's
man?
so
Yeah.
weird. Anyway, sorry, that was,
No, I
I
love that.
enjoyed that
Yeah,
that rabbit trail,
yeah.
but, so I appreciate you opening up and being vulnerable and talking about, your childhood and traumas. That's, it's always been apparent in your work, both in the podcast and even as an actor and comedian, your authenticity. But since we do talk a lot about difficult stuff that we go through, I always end the podcast by asking, what is the thing that you love most about yourself?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question. These are the things that stump me. Um, what I most about myself. Wow. Please get ready to cut out a bunch of silence as I go through. I'm trying to give you a good answer. What I love most about myself is my want and desire to create community. I think it's such an important thing to have around you, to have people and friends and parties and like, it's so hard to, sometimes I like that I will plan things. It's easy not to plan, it's easy not to go do things. Um, I like doing it. My deficit is that I don't know where to stop the invite list, but the benefit is, like, I want to get a game night together. I want everybody to go out to the movies. I wanna go rent a house with friends. I wanna, like, I I like being surrounded and having a good time with the people I love, like, that to me is probably, that want, and then also I think that that ability to actually execute on it, that's what I would say is, the best thing I like about myself.
I just want to thank you again for
Oh my gosh, you're lovely too.
being willing to come on here and open up and spill your heart. So yeah, I appreciate you.
Of course, no, thank you so much, and, this is a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, if you're ever back in Dallas, I'll for sure be there.
Oh my
And
gosh, I'll hook you up, whatever you
uh,
need.
dude, for sure, I will let you know. And next time I'm in LA, if you're performing, I'm going to come see you too.
Oh,
So
yeah, let me know, please. Alright, I'd love
we'll
it.
do. Awesome.
Alright,
I'll
talk to you soon.
talk to you later.